There's a woman who lives in a 900 square foot apartment in downtown Seattle. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, built in 1987. Her neighbors assume she's a public school teacher or maybe a non-profit worker making $45,000 a year. What they don't know is that she owns 7 rental properties across 3 states, generating $18,000 monthly in passive income. Her investment portfolio exceeds $3.8 million. She could buy a 4,000 square foot house in the suburbs tomorrow if she wanted. She chooses the small apartment on purpose. According to a 2024 Schwab Modern Wealth Survey, 58% of millionaires live in homes valued below the median price for their area. A Federal Reserve study tracking wealth accumulation found that households spending less than 15% of income on housing had 4.2 times higher net worth than those spending over 30%. Regardless of total income, the pattern is consistent across income levels. The less you spend on where you live, the more wealth you actually build. Meanwhile, 43% of Americans spend more than 30% of their gross income on housing. They're stretching for the bigger house, the better neighborhood, the address that impresses. One group prioritizes living space. The other group prioritizes net worth. These are rarely the same people. This video isn't about living in deprivation. It's about understanding something most people discover too late. Your house is the single biggest wealth destroyer in your financial life. And the millionaires who figured this out early are now living on different financial planets than everyone else. The research on housing and wealth accumulation tells a story nobody wants to hear. Dr. Elizabeth Dunn at the University of British Columbia spent years studying the relationship between housing choices and financial well-being. Her findings were brutal. Homeowners who upgraded to larger, more expensive houses showed measurably lower life satisfaction 5 years later compared to those who stayed in modest homes. Despite identical income increases, the bigger house doesn't make people happier. It makes them busier, more stressed, and significantly poorer. A Zillow analysis of wealth trajectories found that households maintaining housing costs below 20% of income accumulated wealth at rates 340% higher than households spending 35% or more. This wasn't marginal. This was transformational. The explanation is mathematical, but most people ignore the math. Every dollar committed to larger housing payments is a dollar removed from investment accounts. Every square foot of extra space costs money in 15 different ways. Higher mortgage payments, increased property taxes, elevated utility bills, more furniture to fill rooms, additional maintenance costs, greater insurance premiums, larger cleaning expenses. The costs compound in directions people don't anticipate until they're locked in. A Fidelity study tracking millionaire behaviors found that 71% of self-made millionaires lived in the same home for at least 15 years. They weren't constantly upgrading. They weren't moving every 5 years for more space. They picked a house they could easily afford, stayed there while their income grew, and invested the difference. Sarah Blakely, founder of Spanx and worth $1.2 billion, lived in a 1,100 square foot apartment while building her company. She could have moved into a mansion. Instead, she redirected every available dollar into growing the business. By the time she moved into a larger home, she'd already sold the company for over $1 billion. The modest apartment wasn't poverty, it was strategy. Warren Buffett's house in Omaha is 6,570 square feet. For a man worth $135 billion, this is the equivalent of someone earning $60,000 a year living in a 400 square foot studio. He's not living large relative to his means. He's living microscopically small. His explanation is simple. A house is an expense that takes money away from investments. The less you spend on it, the more compounds elsewhere. The psychology behind housing decisions reveals why most people make catastrophically expensive choices. Behavioral economist Dan Ariely documented a phenomenon called relative deprivation. People don't evaluate their housing in absolute terms. They evaluate it relative to their peers, their parents, and their past selves. A 1,200 square foot house feels small if your coworker just bought 2,400 square feet. A 3-bedroom home feels inadequate if your sister has 4 bedrooms. A 20-year-old kitchen feels dated if Instagram shows renovated kitchens with marble countertops. Housing decisions are almost never about actual needs. They're about closing perceived gaps with others. Research from the Journal of Consumer Psychology shows that housing comparison triggers the strongest status anxiety of any purchase category. Cars can be explained away. Clothes can be rationalized. But where you live feels like a direct measure of your success or failure as an adult. This emotional loading makes housing decisions particularly vulnerable to irrational spending. A 2023 Bankrate survey found that 67% of homebuyers regretted their purchase within the first year. The top reason wasn't structural problems or neighborhood issues. It was financial strain. They'd stretched too far, committed too much of their income, and now felt trapped by payments they could barely sustain. The millionaires who chose smaller homes avoided this trap entirely. They experienced what researchers call housing contentment, the satisfaction that comes from living well below your means. Every month their mortgage payment felt easy. Every month they had surplus income. Every month they invested rather than stressed out. The opportunity cost of housing decisions stacks up in ways that destroy generational wealth. A couple earning $150,000 annually faces a choice. They can buy a $400,000 house with a $2,100 monthly payment, or they can buy a $600,000 house with a $3,200 monthly payment. The $1,100 monthly difference seems manageable. That's the trap. Over 30 years, that $1,100 monthly difference invested at 7%. Annual returns becomes $1.36 million. That's not the price of the bigger house. That's the opportunity cost of choosing it. The couple in the smaller house reaches retirement with an extra $1.36 million they can actually spend. The couple in the bigger house has a bigger house, but the math gets worse. The bigger house costs more in every dimension. Property taxes average $800 more per year. Insurance costs $400 more annually. Utilities run $150 more per month. Maintenance averages 1 to 2% of home value per year. That's an extra $4,000 annually. Furniture to fill the extra rooms costs another $10,000 over the first few years. Sum these additional costs over 30 years. And the bigger house doesn't cost $200,000 more. It costs approximately $650,000 more when you include all the secondary expenses. Invested at 7% returns, that becomes $2.4 million in opportunity cost. The couple who chose the smaller house retires with $2.4 million more in spendable assets. The couple who chose the bigger house has memories of extra bedrooms they rarely used. Real estate industry narratives actively work against wealth accumulation. The National Association of Realtors publishes data showing that home equity represents the largest component of household wealth for most Americans. This is presented as evidence that buying the biggest house possible builds wealth. The logic is backwards. Home equity is the largest component of household wealth because most people put all their money into housing and nothing into investments. They're house rich and cash poor. Their net worth is trapped in an illiquid asset they can't access without selling the place they live. A 2022 analysis by the Urban Institute found that homeowners with houses but minimal liquid investments had lower financial security than renters with substantial investment portfolios. The house feels like wealth because it's visible and tangible. The brokerage account feels abstract because it's just numbers on a screen. But liquidity determines financial freedom. The person with $800,000 in index funds can access their wealth immediately. The person with $800,000 in home equity cannot. Millionaires who stayed in modest homes understood this distinction. They treated housing as a consumption expense, not an investment. They kept housing costs low so they could invest in actual wealth-building assets that generated returns and provided liquidity. The social dynamics of housing choices create pressure that most people cannot resist. Researcher Elizabeth Halkett coined the term aspirational class to describe middle and upper middle income professionals who compete through housing and lifestyle displays. They're not buying shelter. They're buying membership in a status tier. Asterisk, the 3,000 square foot house in the good school district signals that you've arrived. It signals that your children will receive advantages. It signals that you're a serious professional, not someone scraping by. These signals feel necessary in professional environments where perception shapes opportunity. The problem is that everyone else in your peer group is playing the same game. You buy the 3,000 square foot house to signal success. Your neighbor buys 3,500 square feet to signal more success. Someone else builds 4,000 square feet. The arms race never ends. You're running on a treadmill that moves faster the harder you run. The millionaire in the 900 square foot apartment opted out of the arms race entirely. They're invisible to the status competition. Nobody looks at their modest apartment and feels threatened or impressed. This invisibility provides enormous financial relief. They're not competing with neighbors. They're not comparing square footage with colleagues. They're compounding wealth while everyone else compounds housing payments. Research from Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School found that high-income professionals living in expensive housing reported higher stress levels and lower life satisfaction compared to equally high-income professionals living in modest housing. The bigger house didn't improve life. It created maintenance burdens, financial pressure, and social comparison anxiety that diminished well-being. The modest housing strategy also protects against lifestyle inflation. Behavioral research shows that people calibrate their spending to their environment. Live in an expensive neighborhood and you'll unconsciously match the spending patterns of neighbors. The restaurants become pricier, the cars become nicer, that vacations become more elaborate. Your expenses inflate to match your surroundings. Live in a modest neighborhood, and the opposite happens. The baseline spending of everyone around you is lower. Frugality feels normal rather than restrictive. A 2021 study in the Journal of Economic Behavior found that households who moved to lower-cost housing increased their savings rate by an average of 8.7% within 2 years. Even when controlling for income changes, the millionaire staying in modest housing maintains a savings rate that seems impossible to their colleagues living in expensive neighborhoods. Their secret isn't higher income, it's lower housing costs creating a wider gap. between earning and spending. The impact on children is particularly significant. Research from The Millionaire Next Door showed that children raised in modest homes developed stronger financial habits than children raised in luxury homes. The modest environment taught delayed gratification, contentment with less, and the value of saving over displaying. Children raised in expensive homes developed expectations of continuous affluence. They assumed they'd naturally maintain their parents' lifestyle without understanding the income required to sustain it. Many ended up financially dependent on parents well into their 30s because they couldn't afford the lifestyle they'd been raised to expect. Dr. Brad Cluntz, a financial psychologist, documented what he calls affluenza, a dysfunctional relationship with money that develops in children raised with excessive luxury. These children often struggle with motivation, entitlement, and an inability to build wealth independently. The expensive house meant to provide advantages actually created psychological disadvantages that lasted decades. Parents living in modest housing while building wealth created different outcomes. Their children saw resourcefulness, not deprivation. They learned that success means having options, not having possessions. They developed financial resilience that wealth transfers alone cannot provide. The flexibility of modest housing costs extends into every financial decision. The person spending $4,000 monthly on housing has limited career options. They can't take a pay cut for a better opportunity. They can't start a business with uncertain income. They can't take a year off to retrain. They're locked into their current income level because housing commitments demand it. The person spending $1,800 monthly on housing has vastly more freedom. They can pursue opportunities that don't maximize income. They can take calculated risks. They can leave toxic work environments. Their housing costs don't trap them in situations they'd rather leave. This flexibility becomes increasingly valuable over a career. A Harvard Business School study tracking career trajectories found that professionals with low fixed costs, especially housing, changed jobs 2.3 times more frequently and earned 34%. Moreover, 20-year periods compared to peers with high fixed costs. The ability to leave and negotiate created compounding career advantages. The millionaire in the modest apartment could quit their job tomorrow. Their colleague in the expensive house cannot. That asymmetry shapes every workplace interaction, every negotiation, every decision about what opportunities to pursue. The retirement math exposes the full magnitude of housing decisions. Two people earn identical incomes over 35-year careers. Person A spends $2,000 monthly on housing. Person B spends $4,000 monthly on housing. Both invest what remains after expenses. Person A invests $2,000 monthly more than person B for 35 years. At 7% average returns, that becomes approximately $3.4 million more at retirement. This isn't marginal. This is the difference between retiring at 60 and working until 75. The difference between comfort and struggle. The difference between options and limitations. Person B has a nicer house throughout those 35 years. Person A has financial independence and 7 more years of retirement. Most people choose person B's path without ever running person A's numbers. The modest apartment strategy works because it inverts conventional wisdom about what success looks like. Conventional wisdom says success means upgrading your living situation as your income grows. The millionaires who actually build wealth do the opposite. As their income grows, they keep housing costs flat and invest the difference. This requires rejecting social scripts about what your house should signal. It requires ignoring real estate agents who tell you how much house you can afford based on maximum debt capacity. It requires disappointing people who expect you to live larger as you earn more. The reward is financial freedom that luxury housing can never provide. The 900 square foot apartment represents a choice to value liquidity over square footage, freedom over display, wealth over appearance. The neighbors who judge the modest apartment are the same neighbors who will work until they die because they have no choice. The millionaire in that apartment could stop working anytime. The cultural programming around housing runs deep. Parents tell children that buying the biggest house possible builds wealth. Real estate agents encourage buyers to stretch their budgets. Mortgage lenders approve loans up to debt-to-income limits that leave borrowers housepoor. Friends judge each other's success by the size and location of homes. Breaking free from this programming requires seeing housing decisions clearly. Your house is not your primary investment. It's your primary expense. The goal isn't to maximize house. The goal is to minimize housing costs while maximizing invested capital. Every millionaire who chose the modest apartment understood something that most people never figure out. Wealth isn't about the house you live in. It's about the investments you don't have to sell. It's about the jobs you don't have to keep. It's about the freedom you purchased with money you didn't spend on extra bedrooms. The 900 square foot apartment in downtown Seattle represents a choice that most people consider only after it's too late. It represents a decision to build wealth quietly while everyone else builds houses loudly. The person living there could buy the mansion anytime. She chooses not to. That choice is worth $3.8 million and counting. Looking at housing through this lens transforms every real estate decision. The question isn't how much house can I afford. The question is how little house can I be happy with. The gap between those two answers is the space